Sarah Martinez had always believed that truth was worth dying for. At 28, she had already covered 3 major conflicts across 2 continents. But nothing had prepared her for the assignment that would change her life forever. The dusty roads of Afghanistan stretched endlessly before her convoy as she clutched her camera bag and notebook, the familiar weight of her bulletproof vest pressing against her chest. The year was 2011, and Sarah worked for Global News Network, one of the most respected international broadcasting companies. She had earned her reputation by going where other journalists feared to tread, bringing stories from the world's most dangerous places directly into people's living rooms. Her colleagues often joked that she had ice water in her veins, but Sarah knew the truth was different. Every assignment terrified her, but her commitment to telling the stories of those caught in conflict drove her forward. The convoy consisted of 3 armored vehicles carrying a mix of international journalists, military liaisons, and security personnel. Sarah's cameraman, Jim Peterson, had been her partner for 2 years. They had developed an almost telepathic understanding of each other's movements in dangerous situations. Jim was a veteran who had covered wars since the 1990s, and his steady presence always calmed Sarah's nerves. Their destination was a remote outpost in Helmand Province, where they planned to document the daily lives of soldiers and local civilians caught between Taliban forces and coalition troops. The military had promised them unprecedented access to ongoing operations, including the chance to accompany patrols into some of the most contested areas of the region. As their vehicle bounced along the rocky terrain, Sarah reviewed her notes from previous interviews. She had spoken with dozens of soldiers, each with their own story of fear, courage, and homesickness. What struck her most was how young many of them were, barely out of their teens, thrust into situations that would test the limits of human endurance. The landscape outside her window was breathtakingly beautiful despite the constant threat of danger. Mountains rose like ancient sentinels against the deep blue sky, while small villages dotted the valleys below. Children would sometimes wave at their convoy from the roadside, their faces bright with curiosity despite the hardships they faced daily. Sarah's phone buzzed with a message from her editor back in London. The story was generating significant interest among viewers, and the network wanted her to extend her stay by another week. She agreed without hesitation, knowing that the most important stories often required patience and persistence to unfold properly. The military liaison, Captain Roberts, briefed the journalists about the security situation as they approached the outpost. Intelligence reports suggested increased Taliban activity in the area, but nothing that would prevent their planned coverage. Sarah felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and anxiety that preceded every major assignment. When they finally arrived at Forward Operating Base Courage, Sarah was struck by how the soldiers had created a small piece of home in this hostile environment. Photos of families hung in makeshift recreation areas, and the smell of coffee mixed with diesel fuel and dust created an oddly comforting atmosphere. The base commander, Colonel Thompson, welcomed the media team personally. He was a career soldier with tired eyes who had seen too much war, but he understood the importance of showing the world what his troops faced daily. He assigned them quarters in the journalists' compound and promised full cooperation with their coverage. That first evening, Sarah interviewed several soldiers about their experiences. She met Private Anderson, a 19-year-old from Ohio who had joined the Army to pay for college. His letters home painted a picture of homesickness mixed with genuine pride in his service. Sergeant Williams, a career soldier with 3 tours under his belt, spoke candidly about the psychological toll of constant vigilance. As night fell over the base, Sarah lay in her narrow bunk listening to the sounds of military life around her. Generators hummed constantly, radios crackled with reports from patrol units, and the occasional helicopter landing reminded everyone that they were in an active war zone. She thought about her own journey to this moment. Growing up in a small Texas town, she had never imagined herself in places like this. Her journalism degree had seemed like a safe choice, but something deep inside her had always pulled toward the stories that mattered most, even when they were the most dangerous to tell. The next morning brought news that would set the stage for everything that followed. Intelligence reports indicated that a high-value Taliban commander was operating in a village about 15 kilometers from the base. A special operations team was being assembled to investigate, and Colonel Thompson offered Sarah and her team the chance to accompany them. It was exactly the kind of opportunity that Sarah had come here hoping to find. The chance to document special operations in real time was unprecedented, and she knew it could provide viewers with insights into the complexity of modern warfare that they had never seen before. Jim expressed some reservations about the assignment, pointing out that special operations were inherently more dangerous than regular patrols. But Sarah's instincts told her this was a story worth the risk. After discussing it privately, they agreed to accompany the mission. The special operations team was led by Lieutenant Marcus Stone, a soft-spoken professional who had earned his men's respect through competence and courage. His team consisted of 12 highly trained soldiers, each specializing in different aspects of their mission. They would leave before dawn, approach the village on foot, and conduct reconnaissance to determine the target's location. As Sarah prepared her equipment for the mission, she felt the familiar pre-assignment ritual that had become second nature to her. She checked her cameras, tested her recording equipment, and reviewed her notes one final time. The weight of responsibility settled on her shoulders as she realized that she might be the only person capable of telling the world what happened in the next 24 hours. The briefing that evening was thorough and sobering. Aerial reconnaissance had identified several potential compounds where the Taliban commander might be hiding. The team would move in under cover of darkness, establish observation positions, and wait for confirmation of the target's presence before deciding on their next course of action. Sarah understood that she would be witnessing one of the most sensitive and dangerous aspects of modern military operations. The success or failure of missions like this one could have implications far beyond the immediate tactical situation, potentially affecting the broader strategy of the entire war effort. That night, as she made final preparations for departure, Sarah called her sister back home. She couldn't reveal details about her upcoming assignment, but she wanted to hear a familiar voice before stepping into the unknown. The conversation was brief and cheerful, full of family news that seemed to come from another world entirely. As she ended the call and settled into her bunk for a few hours of sleep, Sarah had no way of knowing that the next day would test every skill she had developed as a journalist, every ounce of courage she possessed, and ultimately transform her from an observer of conflict into an active participant in life and death decisions that would haunt her for years to come. The alarm buzzed at 0400 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn darkness like a knife. Sarah had barely slept, her mind racing with anticipation and nervous energy. Around her, the special operations team moved with quiet efficiency, their movements practiced and deliberate despite the early hour. Lieutenant Stone gathered everyone for a final briefing in the command tent. The target village, designated as Objective Alpha, sat in a valley surrounded by rocky hills that provided excellent observation positions. Intelligence suggested that the Taliban commander, known by the codename Scorpion, had been using the village as a base for coordinating attacks against coalition forces. Sarah adjusted her equipment one final time, ensuring that her cameras were easily accessible while still allowing her to move quickly if necessary. Jim checked his video camera and backup recording devices, both of them understanding that they might only get one chance to document whatever unfolded. The team moved out in single file, their night vision goggles casting an eerie green glow as they navigated the rocky terrain. Sarah found herself between two soldiers, Corporal Martinez and Specialist Johnson, who had been assigned to ensure her safety during the mission. Both were seasoned veterans who took their protective duties seriously. The march to Objective Alpha took 3 hours through increasingly difficult terrain. Sarah's respect for the soldiers around her grew with each kilometer as she watched them navigate obstacles that would have stopped most civilians in their tracks. Their physical conditioning was impressive, but even more remarkable was their mental discipline and attention to detail. As they approached the target area, Lieutenant Stone called a halt and established their observation post on a ridge overlooking the village. Through her camera's telephoto lens, Sarah could see the compound that intelligence had identified as the most likely location for their target. It was a typical Afghan family home, with high walls surrounding a central courtyard and several smaller buildings. The waiting began at 0800 hours, and Sarah quickly learned that special operations involved far more patience than action. The soldiers took turns monitoring different sectors of the village through high-powered scopes and binoculars, looking for any sign of the Taliban commander or his associates. Hours passed with little activity visible in the target compound. Villagers went about their daily routines, children played in the dusty streets, and elderly men gathered in small groups to share tea and conversation. Sarah filmed these peaceful moments, understanding that they provided important context for whatever might happen later. Around midday, Specialist Rodriguez, who was monitoring radio communications, picked up chatter that suggested increased Taliban activity in the area. The intercepted conversations were fragmented and coded, but they contained enough detail to suggest that something significant was happening. Lieutenant Stone made the decision to move closer to the village for better observation. Sarah and Jim followed the team as they repositioned to a rocky outcrop that provided clear lines of sight to multiple buildings in the target compound. The new position was more exposed but offered much better surveillance opportunities. It was from this position that Sarah first saw him. A man matching the physical description of Scorpion emerged from the main building in the compound, accompanied by 4 other men carrying weapons. Through her telephoto lens, she captured clear footage of the target as he moved between buildings, apparently coordinating some kind of operation. Lieutenant Stone confirmed the identification through his own observation equipment and immediately radioed the information back to base command. The response was swift and decisive. They were authorized to continue surveillance and gather additional intelligence about the target's activities and associates. Over the next 2 hours, Sarah documented a steady stream of armed men arriving at the compound. Her camera captured faces, weapons, and movement patterns that would later prove invaluable for intelligence analysis. She realized that she was witnessing the formation of what appeared to be a significant Taliban operation. The soldiers around her maintained their professional focus, but Sarah could sense the mounting tension as the situation evolved. Radio chatter increased, and she noticed that Lieutenant Stone was receiving updated instructions from higher command with increasing frequency. As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the mountains, the nature of the activity in the compound changed dramatically. Instead of individual fighters arriving, entire groups began moving through the village in coordinated patterns. Sarah's training as a journalist helped her recognize that she was observing the preparation for a major military operation. Jim whispered to her that he was running low on battery power for his main camera, but his backup equipment was fully charged. They made the switch quietly, not wanting to create any unnecessary noise or movement that might compromise their position. The Taliban fighters below seemed to be conducting final preparations for departure. Weapons were distributed, equipment was loaded into vehicles, and the target himself appeared to be giving final instructions to various group leaders. Lieutenant Stone received new orders that changed everything. Rather than continue passive surveillance, his team was now tasked with preventing the Taliban force from leaving the village. Intelligence analysis suggested that they were planning a major attack on coalition forces, possibly targeting the very base where Sarah had been staying. The soldiers began immediate preparations for what would become an ambush operation. Sarah realized that her role as an observer was about to become much more complicated and dangerous. She would be documenting not just the activities of the enemy, but also the actions of the soldiers protecting her. As evening approached, the Taliban force began moving out of the compound in a convoy of vehicles and on foot. Lieutenant Stone's team positioned themselves along the route that intelligence predicted the enemy would take, setting up what military professionals call a kill zone. Sarah found herself crouched behind a large boulder with Jim, both of them adjusting their camera settings for the lower light conditions. The soldiers around them moved with practiced efficiency, each man knowing exactly what his role would be in the coming engagement. The first Taliban vehicle appeared on the road below, just as the sun touched the horizon. Sarah's camera captured the moment when 2 worlds were about to collide, the peaceful Afghan countryside and the violent reality of modern warfare. Through her lens, she could see the faces of the fighters in the vehicles, most of them young men who probably had their own families and dreams. Lieutenant Stone raised his hand, preparing to give the signal that would initiate the ambush. Sarah held her breath, knowing that the next few minutes would determine the success or failure of weeks of intelligence gathering and planning. The radio crackled with a final confirmation from Base Command. The mission was authorized to proceed, and the safety of hundreds of coalition soldiers depended on stopping the Taliban force before they could carry out their planned attack. As the enemy convoy moved deeper into the kill zone, Sarah realized that she was about to witness and document one of the most critical moments in the ongoing conflict. Her camera would capture not just the tactical details of the engagement, but also the human cost and complexity of decisions made in the heat of battle. The weight of that responsibility pressed down on her as Lieutenant Stone's hand began to fall, signaling the beginning of an engagement that would test everyone's courage, training, and commitment to their respective causes. The first shots shattered the evening silence like thunder. Lieutenant Stone's signal had unleashed a precisely coordinated ambush that caught the Taliban convoy completely off guard. Sarah's camera captured the initial moments of the engagement as muzzle flashes lit up the darkening landscape, and the lead vehicle swerved violently off the road. The Special Operations team had positioned themselves perfectly along the narrow valley road. Each soldier had a specific sector of responsibility, and their disciplined fire created an effective barrier that prevented the enemy convoy from advancing or retreating. Sarah found herself in the middle of a textbook military operation, documenting every detail through her camera lens. The Taliban fighters responded quickly despite being surprised. They abandoned their vehicles and took cover behind rocks and in roadside ditches, returning fire with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. The peaceful valley was transformed into a battlefield within seconds, with tracer rounds streaking through the air like deadly fireworks. Jim's camera captured the professional calm of the American soldiers as they maintained their firing positions despite incoming rounds impacting dangerously close to their location. Corporal Martinez, crouched near Sarah's position, methodically engaged targets while keeping one eye on the journalist's safety. The engagement continued for 20 minutes of intense combat. Sarah watched through her telephoto lens as individual dramas played out across the battlefield. She saw Taliban fighters attempting to flank the American position, only to be driven back by accurate rifle fire. She documented the moment when Specialist Johnson was wounded by shrapnel but continued fighting despite his injuries. Lieutenant Stone moved constantly along his team's position, coordinating their fire and communicating with Base Command. His calm leadership under pressure was remarkable to witness, and Sarah understood why his men followed him with such confidence and dedication. The tide of battle shifted when the Taliban fighters attempted to escape on foot through the rocky terrain above the road. This move exposed them to the superior marksmanship training of the Special Operations team, and Sarah's camera captured the decisive moments when enemy resistance began to collapse. However, just as victory seemed certain, everything went wrong. A group of Taliban fighters that had been hidden in the hills behind the American position launched a surprise attack from the rear. The Special Operations team found themselves caught in a deadly crossfire, with enemies shooting at them from both sides of the valley. Sarah watched in horror as Corporal Martinez was hit by multiple rounds and collapsed near her position. Specialist Johnson, despite his own wounds, attempted to reach his fallen comrade, but was driven back by intense enemy fire. The carefully planned ambush had become a desperate fight for survival. Lieutenant Stone immediately recognized the gravity of their situation and began organizing a fighting withdrawal to more defensible terrain. But the Taliban fighters who had attacked from behind were well-positioned and determined to prevent the American team from escaping the trap they had created. It was at this moment that Sarah faced a decision that would change her life forever. Jim's camera had been damaged by shrapnel, leaving only her equipment to document what was happening. But, more importantly, she realized that the soldiers around her were in genuine danger of being overrun by superior enemy numbers. Corporal Martinez was bleeding heavily from his wounds and needed immediate medical attention. Specialist Johnson was trying to provide first aid while also returning fire, but the enemy pressure was too intense for him to do both effectively. Other members of the team were pinned down in their positions, unable to maneuver or assist their wounded comrades. Sarah made a choice that violated every principle of journalistic neutrality she had ever been taught. She set down her camera and crawled toward Corporal Martinez's position, grabbing the first aid kit from his tactical vest. Her hands shook as she applied pressure to his wounds, but her actions freed Specialist Johnson to focus entirely on fighting. The enemy fire intensified as the Taliban fighters realized how close they were to achieving a significant victory. Automatic weapons chattered constantly, and explosions from grenades shook the ground around Sarah's position. She could hear Lieutenant Stone shouting orders, trying to coordinate his team's response despite the chaos surrounding them. Through the smoke and confusion, Sarah saw movement in the rocks above their position. A group of Taliban fighters was attempting to get close enough to throw grenades down on the trapped American soldiers. If they succeeded, the entire team would be killed or captured. Without thinking, Sarah picked up Corporal Martinez's rifle. Her father had taught her to shoot when she was a teenager, and she had maintained her marksmanship skills over the years, but she had never imagined using a weapon in combat. The weight of the rifle felt strange in her hands as she aimed at the enemy fighters moving through the rocks above. Her first shot missed completely, but it forced the Taliban fighters to take cover and disrupted their advance toward grenade range. Sarah's second shot was more accurate, hitting one of the enemy fighters in the shoulder and causing him to drop his weapon. The other fighters in the group began focusing their attention on her position. Lieutenant Stone saw what Sarah was doing and provided covering fire to protect her as she continued shooting. Her third and fourth shots found their targets, and the immediate threat from above was neutralized. But more enemy fighters were moving through the rocks, and the situation remained desperate. The battle had become a close-range firefight with life-or-death stakes for everyone involved. Sarah found herself shooting at human beings who were trying to kill her and the soldiers around her. Each shot required a conscious decision to take a life in defense of others, and the moral weight of those decisions would stay with her forever. Specialist Johnson had managed to stop most of Corporal Martinez's bleeding, but the wounded soldier needed evacuation to proper medical facilities as soon as possible. Lieutenant Stone was coordinating with base command to arrange helicopter support, but the enemy fire was too intense to allow a safe landing in their current position. Sarah continued firing at enemy positions, surprised by how quickly her civilian instincts had adapted to the demands of combat. Her journalism training had taught her to observe and record, but her human instincts were focused entirely on survival and protecting the wounded soldier beside her. The enemy fighters seemed to sense that they were close to victory and pressed their attack with increasing intensity. Grenades exploded closer and closer to the American position, and several team members had been wounded by shrapnel and small arms fire. It was then that Sarah noticed movement in a cluster of rocks about 50 meters to her left. A Taliban fighter was positioning himself with what appeared to be a rocket-propelled grenade launcher, preparing to fire directly into the American position. If that weapon found its target, everyone in the immediate area would be killed instantly. Sarah aimed carefully, knowing that she might only have one chance to prevent a catastrophe. Her hands were steady despite the chaos around her, and her shot was true. The enemy fighter collapsed, and his weapon fell harmlessly among the rocks where he had been hiding. As the immediate threat was neutralized, Sarah realized that she had crossed a line from which there would be no return. She was no longer a journalist observing conflict from the sidelines. She had become a combatant, and 11 enemy fighters lay dead or wounded as a result of her actions with the rifle. The silence that followed Sarah's final shot was deafening. After hours of constant gunfire, explosions, and shouted orders, the sudden quiet felt unnatural and ominous. Smoke drifted across the battlefield, carrying the acrid smell of gunpowder and the metallic scent of blood. Sarah remained in her firing position, the rifle still pressed against her shoulder, her finger resting on the trigger guard as she scanned for additional threats. Lieutenant Stone's voice cut through the silence as he coordinated a head count of his team. 3 soldiers were wounded, including Corporal Martinez, whose condition remained critical despite Sarah's first aid efforts. The enemy force had been neutralized, but at a significant cost that would affect everyone who survived the engagement. Sarah's hands began to shake as the adrenaline that had carried her through the firefight started to fade. The weight of what she had done began to settle on her shoulders like a heavy blanket. She had killed 11 human beings in the space of 30 minutes, transforming from a neutral observer into an active participant in one of the most violent aspects of human conflict. Jim approached her position carefully, his damaged camera hanging useless around his neck. His face was pale with shock, not just from the battle itself, but from witnessing his partner's transformation from journalist to combatant. They had worked together for 2 years, but he had never seen this side of Sarah's character. "Are you hurt?" he asked quietly, checking her for wounds that she might not have noticed during the intensity of combat. Sarah shook her head, unable to speak as she continued staring at the rocks where her targets had fallen. The reality of taking human life was far different from anything she had imagined during her years of covering conflict. Specialist Johnson moved to take the rifle from her hands, speaking softly as he gently loosened her grip on the weapon. His own wounds had been bandaged with field dressings, but he remained focused on caring for his teammates and the journalists who had fought alongside them. "You saved our lives," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of genuine gratitude mixed with understanding of what the experience had cost her. "Martinez would be dead without what you did. We all would be." Lieutenant Stone approached their position as his team secured the immediate area and prepared for evacuation. His tactical radio crackled with updates from base command as helicopter support finally became available with the enemy threat eliminated. "Ma'am," he said to Sarah, "I need to ask you some questions for my after-action report. What happened here today will need to be documented officially, and your actions will be part of the record." Sarah nodded, still unable to find her voice. The professional part of her mind understood that there would be investigations, reports, and official inquiries into the events of the day. But the human part of her was struggling to process the reality of what she had been forced to do. The sound of approaching helicopters gradually grew louder, providing hope for Corporal Martinez's survival and extraction for the entire team. Sarah watched the wounded soldier's face as Specialist Johnson continued monitoring his vital signs and adjusting his bandages. The young man from Ohio who had spoken about college just days before was fighting for his life because of the violence they had all witnessed and participated in. As the helicopters landed in a clearing about 200 meters from their position, the team began the careful process of moving their wounded comrades to the extraction point. Sarah helped carry equipment and provided support during the evacuation, the journalistic training forgotten as she focused entirely on ensuring everyone reached safety. During the helicopter flight back to base, Sarah sat next to Corporal Martinez's stretcher, holding his hand as the medical team worked to stabilize his condition. The young soldier drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally squeezing her hand when pain broke through the morphine that kept him sedated. The flight gave her time to begin processing what had happened. She had come to Afghanistan to tell the story of soldiers at war, but she had ended up experiencing that war herself in the most direct and personal way possible. The boundary between observer and participant had been permanently erased. Base command was waiting for them when the helicopters landed. Colonel Thompson personally oversaw the transfer of wounded soldiers to the medical facility, while intelligence officers prepared to debrief the team about their encounter with the Taliban force and the successful elimination of the target they had been pursuing. Sarah was taken to a separate debriefing room where she met with military investigators and a psychologist specially trained to help personnel process combat experiences. The questions were thorough but respectful, acknowledging that she had acted to protect American lives under extreme circumstances. The official investigation would later conclude that Sarah's actions had been not only justified but heroic. Her accurate shooting had prevented the enemy from overrunning the American position and had likely saved the lives of the entire Special Operations team. But the official conclusions did nothing to ease the emotional burden she carried. Jim was questioned separately about his observations and the footage he had managed to capture before his equipment was damaged. The video would become crucial evidence in the investigation and would later be used in training materials to teach other soldiers about the realities of combat in Afghanistan. That evening, Sarah sat alone in her quarters, staring at her laptop screen as she tried to write the story that would explain to the world what had happened. But how could she describe the sound a bullet makes when it hits a human body? How could she explain the split-second decisions that determine who lives and who dies in combat? Her editor in London had been briefed about the basic facts of the engagement and was eager to hear her first-hand account. The story would be major news, especially with the revelation that one of their own correspondents had been forced to take up arms in defense of American soldiers. But Sarah found herself unable to write anything that captured the true cost of what had occurred. A knock on her door interrupted her struggles with the story. Lieutenant Stone entered, still wearing his combat gear despite having completed his own debriefing hours earlier. His face showed the exhaustion that follows intense combat, but also a determination to check on everyone under his command, including the journalist who had fought beside them. "I wanted to thank you personally," he said, taking a seat across from her small desk. "What you did today went far beyond anything we could have expected from a civilian. You demonstrated courage under fire that would make any soldier proud." Sarah looked up from her laptop, meeting his eyes for the first time since the battle had ended. "I didn't feel courageous," she admitted. "I was terrified the entire time. I just couldn't watch people die when I might be able to help prevent it." Lieutenant Stone nodded with understanding. "That's what courage actually is," he replied. "Doing what needs to be done despite being afraid. The soldiers under my command know that now they can trust you with their lives, and that's not something any of us take lightly." As he prepared to leave, Sarah asked the question that had been haunting her since the fighting stopped. "Do you think they had families?" "The men I killed today?" Lieutenant Stone paused at the door, considering his response carefully. "Probably," he said honestly. "But they were here to kill us, and to kill innocent people in attacks on coalition forces. You prevented that from happening. Sometimes the choice isn't between good and evil, but between terrible and worse." After he left, Sarah returned to her laptop and began writing. Not the polished news story that her editor expected, but a raw, honest account of what it felt like to cross the line from observer to participant in warfare. She wrote about the weight of the rifle in her hands, the sound of her own breathing as she aimed at living human beings, and the crushing responsibility of deciding who lived and who died. The story would eventually be published, but only after extensive editing and legal review. It would win journalism awards and change how people thought about war correspondents and their role in conflict zones. But for Sarah, the most important audience was herself, trying to understand how a woman who had dedicated her life to telling other people's stories had become the central character in a story of life and death in the mountains of Afghanistan. 3 months after the engagement, Sarah found herself sitting in a military hospital in Germany, holding Corporal Martinez's hand as he took his first steps with a prosthetic leg. The young soldier from Ohio had survived his wounds, but the road to recovery had been long and painful. The rocket-propelled grenade that Sarah had prevented from being fired would have killed him instantly, but the bullet wounds he had sustained left him permanently disabled. "You know," Martinez said as he practiced walking between parallel bars, "I never properly thank you for saving my life that day." His voice carried the same Midwestern accent that had reminded Sarah of home during their first interview, but now it was tempered with the wisdom that comes from surviving combat. Sarah squeezed his hand gently. "You don't need to thank me," she replied. "I did what anyone would have done in that situation." But even as she spoke the words, she knew they weren't entirely true. She had made choices that day that most people would never be forced to make, and those choices had fundamentally changed who she was. The investigation into the engagement had concluded weeks earlier with a complete exoneration of everyone involved. Sarah's actions had been deemed not only justified, but exemplary, and the Pentagon had privately discussed recommending her for a civilian award recognizing her courage under fire. She had declined the recognition, feeling that accepting praise for taking human life, regardless of the circumstances, would somehow diminish the gravity of what had occurred. Jim had returned to London immediately after their evacuation from Afghanistan, and their professional partnership had ended by mutual agreement. He had struggled to reconcile the woman he thought he knew with the person who had calmly and efficiently killed 11 enemy fighters. Their friendship remained intact, but both understood that they could never again work together as they had before. Sarah's story about the engagement had been published to international acclaim, winning her a Pulitzer Prize and establishing her as one of the most respected war correspondents of her generation. But the recognition felt hollow to her, knowing that it was built on the foundation of lives she had taken rather than solely on her skills as a journalist. The psychological counseling that the military had provided helped her process the immediate trauma of combat, but Sarah discovered that the deeper questions about her identity and purpose would take much longer to resolve. She had entered journalism believing that telling the truth was her highest calling, but now she wondered whether her actions in Afghanistan had compromised her ability to remain an objective observer. During her extended stay in Germany, Sarah spent considerable time interviewing other wounded soldiers and their families. She was working on a book about the human cost of modern warfare, focusing on the stories of individuals whose lives had been forever changed by their service in Iraq and Afghanistan. The project gave her a sense of purpose while she worked through her own psychological recovery. Lieutenant Stone visited the hospital during one of his rare leaves from active duty. His special operations team had been deployed to Syria following their successful mission in Afghanistan, and he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a professional soldier who had found his calling despite its dangers. "I've been thinking about what happened that day," he told Sarah during their conversation in the hospital's visitors' lounge. "About the choices we all had to make and the consequences of those choices. I wanted you to know that every member of my team considers you family now. What you did changed all of us." Sarah appreciated his words, but she also recognized that his perspective as a career soldier was fundamentally different from her own. He had trained for years to make life and death decisions under extreme pressure, while she had stumbled into that situation as a civilian with no preparation for the psychological aftermath of combat. The families of the Taliban fighters she had killed haunted her thoughts, particularly during the quiet hours when sleep eluded her. She knew that somewhere in Afghanistan, mothers and wives and children were grieving for men who would never come home. The fact that those men had been attempting to kill American soldiers and innocent civilians did not erase the human cost of her actions. Through her research for the book, Sarah had learned that post-traumatic stress disorder affected not only soldiers but also journalists, aid workers, and other civilians who witnessed or participated in traumatic events. She began working with psychologists to develop better support systems for war correspondents, recognizing that her experience, while extreme, was part of a larger pattern of trauma affecting those who covered conflict. The medical staff at the German hospital had become familiar with Sarah's story, and many of them sought her out for conversations about their own experiences treating wounded soldiers. Dr. Elizabeth Harper, the chief psychologist, became a close friend and professional collaborator as they explored the psychological impact of warfare on everyone it touched. "You're dealing with what we call moral injury," Dr. Harper explained during one of their sessions. "It's different from PTSD because it involves actions you took that conflict with your deeply held beliefs about yourself and your role in the world. The fact that your actions were justified and heroic doesn't eliminate the psychological impact of taking human life." As Sarah's physical recovery progressed, she began to consider her future career options. Several major news organizations had offered her prestigious positions, recognizing that her unique experience had made her one of the most qualified conflict correspondents in the world. But she was no longer certain that returning to active war reporting was the right choice for her. The book project evolved into something larger and more ambitious than she had originally planned. Sarah decided to spend a full year interviewing soldiers, their families, and the families of enemy combatants to create a comprehensive examination of warfare's human cost. The project would require her to return to Afghanistan, but this time as a researcher rather than a frontline correspondent. Corporal Martinez had progressed remarkably well in his rehabilitation, and his determination to rebuild his life inspired everyone around him. He had decided to complete his college education and planned to become a teacher, hoping to share his experiences with young people who might be considering military service. "I don't regret my service," he told Sarah during one of their final conversations before her departure from Germany. "But I want kids to understand what they're really signing up for when they join the military. The recruiters talk about honor and duty, which are real and important, but they don't always explain the full cost of those concepts." Sarah's return to Afghanistan 6 months later was emotional and challenging. She visited the site of the engagement, now peaceful and showing no signs of the violence that had occurred there. Local villagers were suspicious of her presence at first, but when they learned that she was writing about the human cost of war rather than promoting any particular political agenda, several agreed to share their stories. The widow of one of the Taliban fighters she had killed agreed to meet with her, a conversation that proved to be one of the most difficult of Sarah's career. The woman's name was Fatima, and she had lost her husband and the father of her 3 children in the firefight. "I do not hate you," Fatima said through a translator as they sat in her modest home. "You were protecting soldiers who were far from their own families, just as my husband was fighting for what he believed was right. War makes enemies of people who might have been friends in different circumstances." The conversation with Fatima provided Sarah with a perspective that she had been struggling to achieve since the engagement. The woman's grace and forgiveness in the face of devastating loss demonstrated a humanity that transcended the political and military divisions that had created the conflict in the first place. Sarah's book was published 2 years after the engagement, receiving critical acclaim for its balanced and comprehensive examination of warfare's impact on everyone it touched. The royalties from the book funded a foundation dedicated to providing psychological support for journalists, soldiers, and civilians affected by conflict trauma. She never returned to frontline war reporting, instead focusing on longer-term projects that examined the aftermath of conflict and the process of healing in war-torn societies. Her experience in Afghanistan had taught her that the most important stories often unfold long after the shooting stops, in the quiet moments when people attempt to rebuild their lives and communities. The special operations team that had fought beside her continued to stay in touch, and several members attended the book's launch event in Washington, D.C. Lieutenant Stone, now promoted to captain, spoke about the lasting impact of that day on everyone who had been present. "Sarah taught us that courage comes in many forms," he told the audience. "She also showed us that the line between combatant and non-combatant can disappear in an instant when human lives are at stake." Her story is about more than just one engagement in Afghanistan. It's about the choices we all face when confronted with situations that test our deepest values and beliefs. 10 years later, Sarah's story continued to be taught in journalism schools and military academies as an example of how extreme circumstances can transform people in ways they never anticipated. She had discovered that sometimes the most important story a journalist can tell is their own, especially when it illuminates universal truths about human nature and the cost of conflict. The 11 shots she had fired that day in Afghanistan had saved lives, but they had also forever changed her understanding of her own identity and purpose. She had learned that neutrality, while important in journalism, sometimes becomes impossible when human lives hang in the balance. Most importantly, she had discovered that true courage often requires abandoning the safety of observation for the risk and responsibility of action.